They saw it before they heard it. A blue-gray silhouette diving out of the sun, like a blade of light, moving faster than anything the Japanese pilots believed human hands could control. In that frozen heartbeat, as the horizon vanished behind a wall of roaring metal, they understood too late that a new predator had entered the Pacific skies and that nothing would ever be the same again. War, in its quietest moments, reveals its most terrible truths. The ocean glimmers like polished steel, the clouds drift like ancient ghosts, and the men who rise into those skies surrender themselves to forces far greater than nations or flags. This is the story of Japan's first encounter with the F6F Hellcat, the moment an empire built on confidence and myth collided with machine forged in relentless American industry, and the shock that rippled through every cockpit, every briefing room, and every trembling heartbeat that dared to face it. The morning the Hellcat first appeared, the Pacific was unerringly calm, stretching wide and silent beneath the golden haze of a rising sun that seemed unaware of the violence it would soon illuminate, and in that fragile stillness a formation of Japanese A6M0 fighters skimmed just above the waves, their engines humming with familiar, almost comforting rhythm of machinery they believed they had mastered, the aircraft that had dominated the early war and granted Japan a sense of almost divine invincibility in the air. These pilots, many barely 20, carried themselves with the quiet pride of men who had grown up hearing stories of samurai discipline and imperial destiny. And as they climbed into the open blue, they felt the same confidence their instructors whispered into their ears, that the Zero was unmatched, its agility transcendent, its pilots chosen by fate itself. But fate is a fragile thing in war, and destiny does not always favor those who believe they deserve it. For high above them, descending unseen from a blinding shield of the sun, came something they had not been warned about, something the intelligence briefings had only mentioned in vague tones, a new American fighter rumored to be faster, stronger, and deadlier than the Wildcat they had easily outclassed in the early years. The first warning was a streak, nothing more than a flash of metal slicing downward with predatory intent, and by the time the leading Japanese pilot tilted his head upward, the F6F Hellcat was already upon them, its wings broad and brutal, its engine growling with a deep-chested power unlike anything they'd ever heard in the sky, and in that instant the myth of the Zero shattered. The Hellcat did not turn with delicate grace. It did not dance in the air like the Japanese pilots expected. No, it lunged, absorbing their evasive maneuvers with cold, mechanical indifference, using its raw weight and speed not as weaknesses, but as weapons. And with every passing second the Zero pilots felt their world collapsing, as if the sky itself had grown hostile to them. Bullets tore through the morning light, tracer lines carving violent shapes across the horizon as the Hellcat's guns opened with thunderous precision, and the first Zero spiraled downward trailing black smoke, its pilot gripping the controls in trembling disbelief, unable to comprehend how quickly the battle had turned against him. Those who survived the first attack attempted to climb, to turn, to reclaim the altitude advantage that once made them kings of the Pacific. But the Hellcat climbed faster, dove harder, and struck with the brutal certainty of a predator designed specifically to end the reign of the Zero. And as the surviving Japanese pilots finally broke formation, scattering like frightened birds across the trembling sky, a realization spread to them like ice creeping across glass. The Americans had built something monstrous, something that erased every rule they had relied on, every maneuver they had mastered, every shred of superiority they once believed unbreakable. The survivors who limped back to their airfield carried with them a silence far heavier than the bullet holes stitched across their wings, a silence that settled over the tarmac like a funeral shroud as ground crews rushed forward expecting tales of victory, only to be met by hollow eyes and trembling hands that struggled to release their grip on the controls. The senior officers, stern-faced men who had spent years preaching discipline and mental fortitude, felt their confidence waver as the first shaken pilot stepped down from Zero and whispered words that seemed impossible. It dove through us as if we were standing still. Inside the command tent, maps fluttered beneath the breeze of oscillating fans as intelligence officers leaned in close, their pencils hovering uselessly above notepads while pilots described impossible, a fighter that could outclimb, outdive, outshoot, and even outturn them at high speed, a machine with thicker armor, heavier guns, and an engine so powerful it seemed to shake the very air around it. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the myth of Japanese aerial superiority fractured, revealing the terrifying truth that American industry, those endless factories churning out metal and innovation, had awakened in full. And while the officers debated specifications and strategies, outside on the airfield, a solitary pilot stood beneath the wing of a Zero, staring at the machine that had once felt like an extension of his own soul. He traced a fingertip along the smooth curvature of the fuselage, remembering the first time he had flown it, the weightless joy of mastering a craft so responsive it felt alive. But today that same aircraft suddenly seemed fragile, almost naive, like a relic of a world that no longer existed. His ears still rang with the thunderous roar of the Hellcat's engine, a sound that was less a machine and more a declaration, a message carved into the sky announcing that the balance of power had shifted. And as the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the field, he understood what his instructors never said aloud, that war was not won by spirit alone, nor by courage, nor by tradition, but by the merciless evolution of machines built to dominate and survive. The Hellcat had not merely outperformed them, it had humiliated them, stripping away their illusions and leaving them exposed beneath a sky that would only grow more dangerous in the months to come. And as night fell and lanterns flickered along the rows of grounded fighters, a heavy dread settled into the hearts of every pilot present, for they sensed that today was not an anomaly but a warning. Japan had seen the future of air combat, and it was coming for them with unstoppable force. The next encounter came weeks later over the Solomon Sea, where storm clouds hung low like bruises across the sky, and the air smelled of rain and fear, and by then the Japanese pilots had trained relentlessly, refining new tactics, memorizing new maneuvers, convincing themselves that discipline and courage could overcome raw American power. But courage is a fragile shield against the momentum of war, and as their squadron carved white trails through the humid sky, the youngest among them, barely 19, with a photo of his mother tucked beneath his flight suit, felt his heartbeat quicken, not with anticipation, but with a dread he dared not speak aloud. The order came through their radios, crisp and steady, unidentified aircraft approaching from altitude. They climbed, engines straining, the formation tightening as each man reminded himself of the emperor, of duty, of sacrifice. Yet beneath those patriotic vows lurked a quieter, far more human fear, the memory of blue-gray wings and the fire they carried. And then the clouds parted. The Hellcats dropped through like steel angels of judgment, their massive frames glinting in the broken sunlight, their engines howling with a depth that belonged not to machines but to something elemental, something that felt ancient and inevitable. The Japanese pilots tried to break formation, to scatter, to vanish into the safety of the clouds, but the Hellcats were already among them, tearing into formation with ruthless precision born not of desperation, but of confidence, the confidence of men flying a machine that forgave mistakes and punished its enemies without mercy. 1-0 rolled sharply to evade, but the Hellcat simply matched the motion, its heavy wings slicing through the air with shocking grace. And as the young pilot realized he was being hunted, something inside him cracked, a small, devastating understanding that this was not a duel, but an execution written into the sky by forces far beyond him. Another Zero tried to dive for the sea, banking hard left a maneuver that once guaranteed escape. But the Hellcat dove faster, heavier, unstoppable, its gun spitting fire that turned the ocean's surface into a mirror of violent orange flashes. Across the swirling chaos, veteran Japanese pilots fought with all the skill and discipline their training had forged into them. But every turn, every climb, every twist of instinct and experience was overshadowed by the cold, brutal truth that the Hellcat was not just a new aircraft. It was a new era, a symbol of industrial momentum so overwhelming it could not be outflown, outgunned, or outwilled. And as the sky filled with burning wreckage and drifting parachutes, a strange, hollow quiet began forming inside the surviving Japanese pilots. Not the quiet of resignation, but the quiet that comes when a man faces the collapse of the world he believed in. Far below, the sea swallowed the falling aircraft with indifference, as if erasing the evidence of a war that no longer favored the empire that once ruled these skies. And as the Hellcats climbed back into the clouds, victorious and unscarred, the surviving Zero pilots understood with a clarity sharper than grief itself that their beloved aircraft, once the terror of the Pacific, had become a ghost still fighting in a world that had moved on without it. In the months that followed, the legend of the Hellcat spread through Japanese airfields like a cold wind whispering of storms yet to come, and even the proudest pilots, men raised on stories of samurai resolve and imperial destiny, found themselves lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling as a memory of that deep-voiced engine haunted their thoughts. It was not the machine alone that unsettled them, But the realization it carried, the understanding that war, for all its flags and speeches, ultimately bowed to the relentless march of human invention, to the factories where strangers hammer metal with no hatred in their hands, to the engineers who tightened bolts with no thoughts of men who would fall because of them, and for the pilots who faced the Hellcat, there was a painful, humbling clarity in that truth. They were not fighting Americans or allies or ideologies. They were fighting the future. Some of those pilots would never return to their homes. Their final moments spent beneath a sky lit by tracer fire and burning engines, while others would survive long enough to witness the slow unraveling of the empire they once believed eternal, watching as the myths of superiority gave way to the simple, brutal mathematics of industrial power. And yet, in the quiet years after the war, when former enemies sat together beneath peaceful skies and spoke not as soldiers, but as men who had outlived the worst thing humans can do to each other, they found something unexpected lingering beneath the memories of fear and fire, a strange, unspoken respect. For they understood that those who once tried to kill them were also young men following orders they did not write, climbing into aircraft they did not design, praying to survive a sky that cared nothing for courage or loyalty. And in that shared understanding, fragile, human, and painfully honest, they discovered a truth that outlives every war. That beneath the uniforms, beneath the victories and defeats, beneath the roaring engines and shattered empires, all men carry the same fragile heart, seeking meaning in a world that too easily forgets the cost of its own ambitions. The Hellcat may have shocked Japan, may have rewritten the balance of Pacific skies, but the deeper wound it left was a lesson carved into every survivor who lived to remember that power is temporary, war is merciless, and the sky belongs to no nation, only to the silence that follows when the killing finally stops.